Stacy, can you hear us? Can you hear us?
Barely. It's really, really quiet. Hold on one sec. Try again.
We can you hear, which is great.
Go ahead.
Can you say something else?
1 minute.
Oh, there we go. I can hear you.
I know I could hear it differently. You can hear now, right?
Yeah. And you can hear me.
Okay, Christy, we're good. Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Awesome.
Stacy, this is Susie Richards. You and I had a really wonderful talk on the phone about a month ago,
Yes.
and really excited that you're able to be with us today.
Oh my goodness.
As Christy
Yes.
shared, we do record these meetings, so they will be posted on our website. And I know that there's many parents who couldn't be here today, but are really anxious to hear what you have to share. So yeah, really, really happy to have you. Christy, anything you want to
Absolutely.
share before we get started?
Be able to see the share button so you can share your own slides or
Yeah. Should be working momentarily. There we are. Yes.
Great. If you wanted to, I'm sure you're going to do that. Introduce yourself,
Yeah.
and we're ready to roll. Thank you again.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Number one, I love that you do this. I think it's so wonderful. I've looked at the website and seen all of the different coffees with the principal, and I think it's such a valuable resource, and I am honored to be here. So by way of introduction, Stacy Schilter Paisano, she, her pronouns. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist by training. I'm also a certified eating disorder specialist, and a little bit more by way of introduction and with a little backstory, kind of why I'm here. I dealt with an eating disorder in that started when I was 19. And I'll tell you, it came on somewhat suddenly, somewhat out of the blue. In high school, I was an athlete with great grades, didn't have any problems with eating or with body image. But my sophomore year of college, a myriad of things kind of came together that had me engaging in disordered eating behaviors that ultimately threatened my life, and ended my soccer career that I'd had and radically interrupted my college experience. And that was 25 years ago. Treatment was not what it was today. I'd already been studying human services, so I had the desire to help humans. But after the eating disorder experience and also the treatment that wasn't awesome, I really decided that I wanted to help individuals and families impacted by eating disorders, disordered eating, body dissatisfaction. Part of it, was not just because of my own experience, but also the experience of my parents. They were absolutely lost during that time. They didn't know how to help. They didn't understand, but really felt desperate to try or to intervene in some way, but not really knowing how. And so that's what fuels my passion. That's why I do what I do, and would probably keep doing what I do even if my company didn't pay me to do it. So that being said, my company is the Emily Program. I have worked for the Emily Program since we opened our doors in Olympia, Washington in 2014. So for 12 years. And the Emily Program has locations in Olympia, Seattle, Spokane, and across the nation as well, but those are the Washington ones. We do offer virtual services, and I'll be talking much more about that a little bit later on. But from telling that story, one of the things that I just want to highlight is recovery is possible. help is available. And today I just want to help folks become more aware, more informed about what are eating disorders, what to look for, what their prevalence is, all of those pieces. And that being said, before we dive in, if there are any questions, as we go, feel free to put them in the chat or say them out loud if you'd like. I know I'm going to try and limit the specific talk to 30 minutes so we have time for questions after. But if there's just something that you want to stop me and ask, you are more than welcome to. Therapist by training, so I'm accustomed to engaging with groups more so than presenting. So, all that being said, let's dive in. These are our objectives today. This is a really wordy slide, but ultimately, viewers will be able to learn or will learn about the presence of disordered eating, clinical eating disorders in adolescents. You'll all understand the different presentations of disordered eating and clinical eating disorders. You'll develop a better understanding of the variables that contribute to the development and maintenance of disordered eating in adolescents specifically. You'll become acquainted with indicators of that youth might be struggling in their relationship with food or with body. You'll acquire some strategies for talking with adolescents about your concerns, and then also develop awareness about supports available for adolescents and caregivers impacted by disordered eating or clinical eating disorders. One thing too, I do talk a little bit fast. Part of that's to make sure we get all of the content in, but also to make sure you get the information you need. And I have a tendency to soapbox on things, so I'm going to try and avoid that as well. So first, why talk about eating disorders? Lots of information on this slide, but that very large number, the 24 million, is one to highlight. It's one of the reasons we want to talk about these, because more than 24 million people in the United States are living with or suffering from an eating disorder. The reality is that teachers, administrators, school counselors, nurses, coaches, caregivers, and youth, along with really all humans, will encounter or be impacted by clinical eating disorders and disordered eating. One of the statistics on this page that I also like to call attention to is this 1 in 10. So only 1 in 10 people with an eating disorder will receive treatment. And so one of the other reasons that I like to talk with groups of people and raise awareness is to try and change that number, to try and ensure that folks that are struggling in their relationship with food or with body are getting the help that they need. And so we can change that number from not just 10% of individuals struggling, but much higher percentage receive the support and help they need. Here's another infographic that just has a lot of statistics on it. The ones I like to call out on this one, this big one right here at the top, this is an unfortunate reality about eating disorders. They do have a high mortality rate. And so in the United States, approximately every hour, so it's every 62 minutes, somebody dies as a result of an eating disorder or related complications. And that really highlights how concerning these conditions are, as well as the importance of intervention. Another one I like to call out on this one is that the LGBTQ plus community, the individuals that are in that population do have a higher propensity to struggle with an eating disorder, or there's higher susceptibility. And really anyone living with one or more marginalized identities also have an increased risk of developing disordered eating behaviors. Recovery is 100% possible, as I already said. And then also, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, eating disorders don't look a certain way. So you can't tell if somebody is struggling in their relationship with food or body just by the way they look. And I'll say more about that in a few minutes. A couple more reasons why we talk about eating disorders. They affect people of all genders, ages, races, ethnicities, socioeconomic statuses, religions, sexual orientations, and body shapes and sizes. So we like to say that eating disorders do not discriminate. Anyone can live with an eating disorder, and one of the reasons to remember that is to try avoiding making assumptions about an individual based on their presentation or because of their, lived experience or because of their identity. We don't really know who is going to struggle. And so we want to make sure to pay attention, in various different environments to what might be going on with an individual. Another just interesting kind of fun fact that isn't written down on this slide, but something to tell you and maybe something to be aware of because it does counteract the stereotype we have in our minds about eating disorders. So if I asked anybody listening, what your stereotype of an eating disorder is, that stereotype tends to be affluent, white, female, and then underweight is usually part of it. People assume that folks with eating disorders are lower body weighted or in underweight bodies. And the reality is only 6% of people with eating disorders are underweight. And so that kind of helps us better understand, like they're not visible. It's not something that we see. And so it's not just that really underweight or cachectic appearance that somebody has, but instead it can look a wide variety of ways. Another reason we talk about eating disorders, many people who have an eating disorder don't pursue treatment on their own or don't talk about the struggle. So somebody may really be having a hard time in their relationship with food or body, but they might not talk about it. They may even say, I'm fine, this is fine. And we know that the reality is different. I had a young person recently who even though she was in treatment, even though she was, receiving treatment for an eating disorder, she found that talking about the thoughts she was having, the urges she was having, the behavior she was engaging in was really cringy. So she wouldn't, she didn't want to really address those things because it didn't feel good to acknowledge. And so, just be aware of that. Another reason we talk about them, and specific more to this conversation, up to 22% of children and adolescents have a pattern of disordered eating that could signal or lead to a clinical eating disorder. So that's, roughly 1 in 4, right? That's quite a number of individuals. So when we think about your district or your school, likely there might be more people struggling than you're aware of. Eating disorders do have the second highest mortality rate of any mental health diagnosis. So it's taken second to the opioid use epidemic. And just highlighting that reality that people don't tend to talk about it. In one study, more than 50% of adolescents who met full criteria for an eating disorder never talked about their concerns in spite of having contact with a healthcare provider. Whoa, so this slide is really wordy. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on this one, but this is just to give you kind of an overview of the different diagnoses for eating disorders. So there are various different diagnoses according to the DSM-5 that have really specific criteria. They include anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, OSFED, and UFED. Who knew there were so many, right? Coupled that I'll just talk about briefly, binge eating disorder is actually 3 times more prevalent than anorexia and bulimia combined. So that's one that, is really on our radars, but isn't always recognized. And the second one I'll call out is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, because this one is a little less known or people aren't as familiar with it. I think even my own mom, who's, observed me in my own struggle and knows I'm in this field and I talk about eating disorders all the time, I mentioned ARFID to her the other day, and she's like, what is that? So ARFID, or avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, is when an individual is unable to achieve their nutritional needs or their dietary needs, but for really individualized reasons. So that might be due to textural aversions. It might be due to fear of aversive consequences. It might be due to lack of interest in eating. With this eating disorder, there's no body image concern oftentimes. I mean, anyone living in this culture might have some body image concerns, but in general, the food-related behaviors are not driven by body shape and size, and instead just really individualized reasons. We had a client who had this diagnosis who had a fear of choking because they had experienced a choking incident that was really traumatic. And to avoid that outcome, they were just avoiding eating. Or we had another client who dealt with a nut allergy and was inadvertently exposed to nuts, had an anaphylactic reaction, didn't have EpiPen. It was a hot mess. And this was before they were a client. And by the time they came to us, they were unable to eat outside of their own home, off of plates or out of containers that didn't come from their own home, with utensils that didn't come from their own home. So they were really limited in their capacity for intake. So we see a wide variety of presentations with avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. And the reality is, you don't need to worry about diagnoses unless you're a diagnostician or a mental health provider. It's not necessary to worry about what the diagnosis is, but instead pay attention to these things. Is there a pattern to the behaviors? Is there a pattern to the food or body or the movement related behaviors? Do the behaviors happen repeatedly? What happens if the behaviors get interrupted? Is there rigidity, or do the behaviors get prioritized over other things? Then we know there might be something going on. Likewise, if there's preoccupation, during our intake process, we tend to ask people, what percentage of the day are you thinking about food, weight, shape, movement, any of these things? And for many of our clients, that's upwards of 80%. So you can imagine, the students in your district or at your school that are thinking about these things greater than 80% of the time, their mind is preoccupied, right? They're unable to focus because their mind is otherwise engaged in thinking or planning or experience anxiety about something that's already taken place. And then, is there impairment? To what degree do the pattern and the preoccupation get in the way of participation in life? I will share with people that in the midst of the eating disorder I dealt with, I felt like I was standing on the sidelines of life, just watching it go by. I did not feel like I was participatory. I did not feel like I was engaged because so much of my focus was on the various different things that were a part of the eating disorder. All right, we're going to get into what contributes, maintains. I'm going to take a sip of my coffee. So when we're thinking about what contributes to the development of an eating disorder or what maintains an eating disorder once it's already shown up, one thing to really help people understand is that eating disorders are complex, number one. They're biologically based illnesses that are influenced by environmental or psychological factors. So, meaning eating disorders are actually brain-based. So I'm going to start with biological influences. One, we know that the brains of individuals that wind up dealing with an eating disorder or that are struggling with an eating disorder, the function of the brain and then the different mechanisms in the brain and the structure of the brain are actually slightly different based on fMRIs. So when they've done fMRIs, they've observed differences in the brain based on structure and function. Another biological influence that can contribute to the development, particularly if somebody has that genetic susceptibility, because that structure and function is genetically informed, is dieting or food exposure. So if an individual is susceptible to developing an eating disorder and they go on an intentional weight loss diet, or they're experiencing food insecurity, those things can contribute to the development. Neurochemistry is also a biological factor. About 70% of individuals who are living with an eating disorder have a co-occurring mental health condition, whether it be an anxiety disorder, depressive disorder, PTSD, autism spectrum disorder, any number of things. And some of that has to do with the neurochemistry. So the serotonin, the dopamine, and there being an abundance of or an insufficient supply of those neurochemicals in the body. And then I have puberty and menopause under biology as well, because it has been demonstrated that Individuals who go through puberty at an earlier age than their peers have an increased susceptibility to developing an eating disorder because of the heightened awareness of body, and kind of noticing the changes in body are occurring at a different rate than peers, which can just add another layer or a different element there. And for individuals maybe that are transgender or that don't identify with the sex assigned at birth, when puberty occurs and the secondary sex characteristics begin to develop, that can be really off-putting, that can be really activating, and there can be a strong motivation to suppress those secondary sex characteristics. We had a transgender male dealing with a restrictive eating disorder. And as a result of the restrictive eating disorder, they were underweight, their breasts weren't fully developed, their hips weren't fully developed, and they weren't menstruating. And all of those things felt very much in alignment with their identity. And so the idea of recovery was hard because recovery meant weight restoration. It meant that those secondary sex characteristics would develop. So lots of different things that come together in the biological realm. And one thing I didn't say as I started this slide was really there's no one thing that causes an eating disorder, but instead like a confluence of factors or a complex interplay of these genetic and biological and elements that come together. Environmental influences, this is one of those soapboxes that I could get on, but I won't. So obviously in our culture, which we can fondly or not so fondly refer to as diet culture, there's so much weight and appearance pressure. There's so much vilification of particular body sizes and glorification of other body sizes. And there's media messages that go along with those. Particularly right now, there's so many GLP-1 advertisements, for example, and the GLP-1 advertisements specifically for weight loss, because those medications are fantastic for type 2 diabetes, but specifically for weight loss, carry a message with them that if somebody is in a higher weight body, they quote unquote should do something about it. So there's all these media messages. And then our poor youth that are on social media too, there's so much going on social media that is related to body shape and size. And again, that glorification and vilification of different body sizes. Weight comments can contribute, bullying can contribute. All of these factors are part of that environmental world that people are living in. And then our psychological influences, stressors and coping, any type of transition can be challenging, identity and self-image. So I'm going to pause there for just a second because I'll use my own experience as an example. When I was in college playing soccer, my coach changed my position. And I went from being, having a strong identity in soccer and feeling like that was one of the things that people felt proud of me for and one of the things that endeared me to people. And when this change in position occurred, I was no longer kind of a standout. I was just kind of like meh, and I wasn't as good at the position as I had been. It rocked my identity world. And like I said, there's no one thing that causes an eating disorder, but with that, I overtrained to try and get ready for this new position, and did what I could, and it kind of flipped the switch. So lots of things that made me more vulnerable, but there was ultimately a factor that really, like I said, flip that switch. Trauma can be an activator, anxiety, depression, substance use, lots of different things. But this is more for your awareness than anything else. And specifically to adolescents, during adolescence, the brain is developing really rapidly. And what we know is that the emotional brain is developing at a faster rate, which does result in the emotional experience being more pronounced, or perhaps kids experiencing really big emotions. And it's possible you've observed this. There's also physical changes going on. There's growth happening. There's an increased need for fuel. Body shapes and sizes are changing at different rates. So these are all just different factors that kids are dealing with during their adolescent development. Social engagement with adolescents, as many of you may know, there's a strong drive to engage with peers. That idea of belonging and being recognized and being accepted is really a biological need that adolescents are dealing with. And rejection from peers or coaches or teachers or parents, whomever it is, rejection is processed in the same part of the brain as physical pain. And so there's so much that young people are willing to do to avoid rejection, to be connected with peers, to be recognized, and to get their emotional needs met. At the same time, they're going through a stage of life that is characterized by identity versus role confusion. So there's a lot of questions being asked of who am I? Where and how do I fit in? How do I get my emotional needs met? Or for what do I get recognized? And then adding to that, just another layer, there is novelty seeking behaviors that we can see. So the reward circuit of the brain is developing further, which can result in a drive to try new things, be more spontaneous, do things maybe without a lot of foresight. So all of these things can contribute to the development of a problematic relationship with food or body dissatisfaction in general. So one thing to really highlight is that disordered eating and clinical eating disorders for the person struggling may be viewed as a conscious or subconscious solution. We know that eating disorder behaviors serve a function. So if we think about it a little bit like coping, I don't want to simplify, but it is something that I think is important for people to remember. Virginia Satir, who was a famous therapist back in the day, said the problem isn't the problem, coping is the problem. And again, don't want to simplify, but eating disorder behaviors can serve a function similar to self-injurious behaviors, substance use, suicidal ideation, in that individuals may be striving to communicate something. Those behaviors may serve provide a sense of control or mastery. An example I use with that is particularly for people that are restricting. Somebody may be feeling out of control in their world. They may feel out of control of their emotions. They may feel out of control of what's going on in their environment. And that person may start to write down what they eat. Like, I'm just going to write down what I eat. And maybe they tabulate what they eat. And in doing so, they may experience a sense of control. They may experience a sense of mastery if they can keep what they eat below a certain number, or if they're monitoring the scale and they can keep their weight below a certain number, that can give them a sense of control within a world that's otherwise outside of their control. And again, many of these things are subconscious. I did a group on this with some clients the other day, and for a lot of them it was like eye-opening, and likewise, for me in the midst of my struggle, it wasn't like I was thinking, oh, I'm just going to get a sense of mastery and control. It happened rather naturally. Eating disorder behaviors can also help an individual numb from big emotions that they're experiencing, or from those secondary co-occurring mental health conditions. So it can numb anxiety, they can numb depression, they can numb, different internal experiences that folks are having. They can distract from internal or external experiences. They can increase a sense of safety for some individuals, and they can maintain alignment with identity, like I was talking about earlier with that transgender male, for example. Or we have a lot of young people that might talk about kind of establishing an identity as a smaller person. Like, I've always been the petite one, or I've always been, a small person, and they're doing what they can to maintain that. Again, I don't want to simplify because they are very complex conditions, but I think it's always necessary to really emphasize that they develop for a reason. They develop rather naturally and in response to lived experiences. And so I just want to avoid or have people avoid judging that it's a choice, or that, somebody is just seeking attention, because the reality is they are complex, brain-based conditions that are impacted by environment and psychology. Another slide just kind of highlighting that same thing that I just said. If you think about eating disorders a little bit like an iceberg, so icebergs, I think it's like 80% of the iceberg that's below the surface of the water, and we just see the tip of the iceberg. So with this slide, we're just highlighting like what we see is the physical signs and the behaviors. What we don't see is all of the underlying psychological concerns, all of the underlying psychological drivers, all of the different things that are going on for an individual that the symptoms are actually in response to. All right. So what do we look for? What is it that, caregivers, administrative staff, coaches, teachers, nurses, what do we look for? And again, these are not all inclusive lists. We could make much longer lists because everybody's an individual and it's going to present a little bit differently for each person. But some of the behavioral and emotional indicators might be an overfocus on food, body, weight, size, or shape. We could throw exercise into that mix as well. So just kind of an overfocus there. There may be excessive talk about diet or food or ingredients in food, what different things contain or whether or not something is good or bad, kind of that categorization of food, healthy, unhealthy, as opposed to all food is fuel and all food will fuel our body. Changes in eating patterns or appetite. So obviously adolescents go through these. I have a 14-year-old son who, my goodness, some days he's a bottomless pit when it comes to food, and other days he's not hungry. Trust me, on the days he's not hungry, I'm monitoring to see if that becomes a pattern. But I think with adolescents, observing what are the eating patterns, what is their appetite, is it consistent? Or is there some patternistic behaviors that are showing up that seem problematic? Mood and social changes in combination with the above. So that might be increased depression, increased anxiety, increased lability. And again, we're talking about adolescence. And so we know that there's mood changes. We know there's social changes. But I think this is a little bit outside the norm or just paying attention again to that pattern, right? Changes in cognitive processing or cognitive processing capacity or memory. So when we think about eating disorders, most of them involve an element of malnutrition or being undernourished. And as a result, parts of the brain aren't as able to function, specifically the prefrontal cortex, which is that part of our brain that is helping us with tasks and memory. And so if we're noticing a decrease in cognitive capacity, we want to find out why. We want to know what's going on that's occurring. Noteworthy changes in weight, that can be up or down. The asterisk there is because of what I had said earlier about only 6% of people with eating disorders are underweight. So be cautious about making assumptions because of bioindividuality. Not all bodies decrease in size with restriction. So just keeping awareness of that. And if there are noteworthy changes in weight, again, we want to know why. We want to know what's factoring into that. We may observe a layering of clothing. So individuals may layer their clothing in an effort to hide their body or because they're experiencing cold intolerance. So as malnourishment occurs or as somebody's undernourishing their body, they begin to experience cold intolerance or experience cold more readily because their body just doesn't have the same capacity to keep it warm, to engage in that homeostatic process that it normally would. Behavioral indicator might be increased or compulsive exercise or movement. We've had individuals, younger humans that become compulsive about the number of steps they take in a day. And if they don't get that number of steps, they'll be pacing in their bedroom, for example, or they'll be pacing in the living room just to try and achieve that number of steps. That would be an increase in compulsive exercise or movement. And then likewise in the food realm, any limited variety of intake or increased selectivity. So becoming a little bit more particular about foods that are consumed. We have a person recently that we were working with that essentially just got off hot food. They didn't want to eat hot food because they told me somewhere in their mind, they correlated hot food with unhealthy. So any of that, increased selectivity or starting to rule out identified food groups or identified foods, just be aware. Notice that as a potential red flag. Possible indicators in the academic or in-school setting, we may observe inflexible thinking, difficulty switching tasks or topics readily, so decreased cognitive flexibility, really, heightened need for routine and predictability, and that has to do with just that automatic rigidity that starts to occur within the brains of individuals that are undernourished or aren't achieving their dietary needs. You may observe an increase in perfectionism or sensitivity. This would be different than maybe how they previously presented. There may be an avoidance of the school lunchroom or wherever lunch takes place in the school, or an avoidance of socialized eating in general. I did talk to our cross-country coach some time ago that said, I walk through the lunchroom and none of the kids eat. And he was just talking in general about high school kids and do they eat. So we have to, kind of take it within context. But if there is an avoidance of different eating experiences or socialized eating, we want to find out what's going on. Frequent trips to the bathroom, particularly after eating experiences, or to engage in checking behaviors. So checking behaviors are when an individual essentially is checking their body shape and size. So that can be done via mirror checking. It can be done with even like measuring of wrists with fingers. It can be done with using measuring tape. It can be done with the scale. Lots of checking behaviors for individuals that are dealing with body dissatisfaction. It's one of our treatment targets oftentimes is to start decreasing those checking behaviors, because ultimately they aren't helpful and they lend to that preoccupation that people experience. There may be a decreased attention span. There might be increased just lethargy or a flat affect in general. And conversely, there may be kind of an increased and anxious energy, or kind of an increase, like kind of people being a little buzzy, if that makes sense. So that might be twitching one's foot a lot. That wasn't typical before. It might be a lot of movement. It might be really rapid paced talking, almost like a manic presentation, but it's not that. It's just that heightened anxiety as a result of not achieving dietary needs. Excuse me. So what caregivers might observe? There may be increased isolation, so a decrease in social activities. There may be skipping meals or making excuses not to eat. There may be a tendency to go to bathroom after meals to undo what's been consumed. There may be an increased focus on food, size, weight, shape, and body, or diet talk in general. Again, that categorization of foods that I talked about earlier, that fatigue, mood swings, irritability. Again, I know these are realities that we experience in adolescence in general, but just paying attention to the frequency and the pattern. Some of these physical realities might be observed. So that these physical realities include dizziness, chest pain, cold intolerance, hair loss, easily bruising, absence of menses. Anybody with a uterus that is 15 or older should be menstruating. If they're not, we need to kind of look into that a little bit further. Obviously, if they're on hormone replacement or hormone blockers, that makes sense. But if they're 15 or above and aren't taking those medications, menses should be present. And personality changes in general may occur. I've had countless parents say, like, they're just not them anymore. Or there's a wonderful book called Brave Girl Eating, and in it the mom talks about her daughter and says, the daughter's name was Kitty, and mom says, like, there's Kitty and there's not Kitty, because really the eating disorder kind of hijacks the brain. And so we start to see, kind of a different personality presentation. I'm aware of the time, so I'm just going to speed through these last little ones, but you will have access to the deck. If you suspect somebody might be struggling, ask questions compassionately and with a curious tone. School counselors or nurses, you can consider using screening tools if you like. The Eat 26 in particular is a good one. It's the eating attitudes test with 26 questions, readily available online, printed out. It gives you a lot of information. If you do have somebody just complete it. I'm not sure what the rules of the school are and whether or not you're permitted to do that, but it can be really helpful screening tool. And then in conversation, these are all just different suggestions. So describe non-judgmentally and factually what it is that you're observing and for what reason that causes concern. So exhibit said concern, exhibit curiosity, listen with compassion and interest as you get some answers or with a desire to understand. You can test the waters to see what acting opposite the behaviors observed would be like. Like, what might it be like to not achieve that number of steps that you're really wanting? What might it be like to have a hot meal, and if you notice that there are heightened emotions or rigidity or withdrawal and shutdown that accompanies some of those questions or that accompanies, some of that encouragement, that's a red flag, kind of being aware of those things. Offer support, obviously. Ask what would be helpful or what's experienced as supportive. I think that's something that caregivers are frequently wondering is like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what would be helpful. And what I hear from youth is, oh my goodness, this is so not helpful, or I like it when they do this. And having that conversation can be really valuable. And then lastly, you can gauge willingness to participate in an assessment to learn more. So one of the things that we do at the Emily program, and really any eating disorder facility does this, is they will do a comprehensive assessment. And at the end of that, you'll know more. You'll know whether or not an eating disorder diagnosis is present. You'll know what level of care is recommended. You'll know what's recommended in general. And you just have more information coming out of that appointment. What you do with it is entirely up to you, but you will have more information and more to go on. So a little bit more about the levels of care. When somebody is dealing with an eating disorder, we do recommend a multidisciplinary specialized treatment team. So on that team might be a dietitian, medical provider, psychiatrist, therapist, family therapist should be in here as well. And then the client and the caregivers obviously are in the center of this circle. And then our levels of care for eating disorders go from outpatient all the way up to residential treatment. So depending on the severity of the symptoms, depending on the acuity of the problem that's being encountered, we'll make recommendations for level of care based on this. And as you can see, called out in the middle here, our PHP, which is 6 hours a day, and our IOP, which is 3 hours a day, they are both offered in person and virtually. So I'm talking to Whidbey Island schools right now. So if you're on the island, you are able to access services virtually. Prior to the pandemic, I would have said virtual services for eating disorders. How is that going to work? And I'm a true believer now. I oversee 8 different virtual programs for eating disorders, and it can be really, really effective intervention. On this next slide, which you can reference, it just describes what the different levels of care are. And then the ensuing slides all have resources on them. So these are resources available with the Emily program on our website. And then we have some other resources that aren't part of the Emily program, but may be helpful. So whether that be treatment scholarships or financial help or support groups in general that people might want to attend, they're all here on the resources page. One more thing to add is the Emily program does take all insurances. So, all insurances except TRICARE. TRICARE doesn't take us, but everything else we do take. So state insurances and all the commercial insurances. So we don't want that to be a barrier to care for individuals. I could probably keep talking, but instead, I'm going to actually have some conversation with folks. So I'd love to hear questions, love to clarify anything that would be helpful, and go from there.
Thank you so much, Emily. So much information to process. One of the things that
I know it's a little
really
overwhelming. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's so important. One of the things that prompted, the connection with you is we had a parent reach out to us. There was a group of fifth grade girls that had had an overnight um, and talk of diet and body shapes and all the things came up. And it was really scary for me personally to think girls at that age are already
Yeah.
feeling like they have some image they have to maintain of their bodies. And um, is that, are you seeing at this age band, these concerns arising?
Yeah. Yeah. An alarming statistic is that 80% of 10-year-olds are dieting and afraid of quote unquote being fat, which is frightening. Like when I was 10, I was playing kickball and just playing, just enjoying life. But nowadays, I think with the exposure on social media, on online platforms, even commercials. It used to be magazines, right? But now it's all more electronic. I think everyone is inundated with different messages, and I think it's really hard to avoid. And so it has become kind of the water in which we swim. And so I think it is important to talk with youth about their experience in body, to talk about their relationship with food, and ideally, as much as possible, for caregivers to model acceptance of bodies of all sizes, as well as neutrality related to food, because I think sometimes youth can hear caregivers talking about their own bodies or other people's bodies, and that can plant seeds as well. Or if caregivers, are going on their own intentional weight loss diet, they may be talking about food and food ingredients and categorization of foods that kids can pick up on. And so I think it's really important in the home to, make a commitment not to engage in what sometimes we call fat talk or diet talk in general, because it can help with the prevention of development.
I had a question. So you said that you, all through high school you were doing well, and then you had
Mhm.
the situation in college. Um, I have a kid who has ADHD and autism, and a niece who's probably also on the spectrum and has the ARFID. And
Mhm.
how is there a way to know that those conditions do kind of set you up in a way for eating disorders? Is there a way to kind of preemptive before like to like I don't know, like shield against it from
Yeah,
developing?
yeah. I think those are great questions. So I think, ADHD and autism spectrum, are co-occurring conditions that do make somebody more susceptible. And so I think for people in general, but also for individuals that are more susceptible, I think we have to be really just intentional about, kind of how we talk about things, the um, expectations. I'm going to clarify that word with regards to food. So, for example, my own offspring is going to be genetically susceptible to developing an eating disorder because I had one. And so I've been really intentional about not categorizing food, not, vilifying certain eating patterns or other eating patterns, not making comments on body. I think with ARFID, which is what folks on the autism spectrum are more likely to develop, there is this kind of understanding that there might be textural aversions, there might be temperature aversions, there might be just selectivity around food, but being particular and intentional about emphasizing the importance of adequacy. Because I think when individuals are selective, and nowadays I think a lot of kids are selective, regardless of, circumstances. But I think the importance for any youth and for all humans is that we achieve adequacy. So even if there are limited foods or fewer foods that somebody feels comfortable with eating, it's still important to get enough. And so even in treatment, what we focus on is getting enough, and then we'll do expansion of variety when that's relevant. But I think highlighting to young people, like we need to eat adequately for our brains, for our development, for our bones, for our bodies in general. And so I think caregivers can have kind of an expectation of adequacy. That doesn't mean clean plate club necessarily, so much as we need to achieve our dietary needs daily, even if there are, selective foods that we will or won't eat.
I was, can you hear? Yeah. I was
Mhm.
wondering if you could sort of walk us through what it might look like if we did outreach to the Emily program. Like how are we guided through, having conversations with our children and, what are like the next steps?
Totally. So if, for example, you did have a young person that you said, would you be willing to do an assessment? And they're like, I guess, sure. So essentially what would happen when somebody calls the MLA program, or you can enter your own information on our website. It's one of the links that's in the resources, and then the MLA program will call you. But we have a high rate of live answers. So I think the wait time last I heard was like 18 seconds, which is lovely. And then you'll do a call, and if they're able to in that moment, they can do what's just called our phone intake. It's maybe like a 30 to 45-minute conversation, or they'll schedule that with the individual and the caregiver. And during that call, it really is just getting kind of an understanding of what's happening in relationship with food, what's happening with mental health, what's happening in kind of lived experience, family, school, just to better understand the picture. And at the end of that, there would be a recommendation or not, right? If there is a recommendation that says, so it sounds like you're dealing with an eating disorder that we call OSFED, other specified eating feeding or eating disorder, or it sounds like you might be dealing with, a clinical eating disorder. They may not even say the name. What I would recommend is IOP. And IOP is 3 hours a day, 4 days a week. We have it available virtually or in person in these locations. And if they say, ooh, I got to think about it, or okay, or whatever it is, we'll either have our admissions coordinator then contact them to start talking about setting up admission. Or if they say, no, I don't want to do that level of care, then the intake provider may say, well, what about outpatient? Would you be willing to do individual therapy or nutrition counseling once a week? And oftentimes people are open to that. It's a higher level of cares that sometimes can be a harder sell, partially because of the amount of time that goes into it. And for PHP, for example, which is 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, that interferes with school too. And so there is, some consideration that has to be made for caregivers that might be working, for students that are, kind of worried about grades and taking time away from school or getting an accommodation at school. So all of that is, stuff that our admissions coordinator will work with if a recommendation is accepted, or if somebody says, I'm gonna think about it. We have prepared, and I'm happy to share these with you, Susie, if you like. We have prepared kind of talking points for schools. We have a handout that that clients can take to schools, on behalf of their kiddo, just to say like, hey, this person's dealing with a life-threatening or life-interfering mental health condition. We're requesting that you accommodate them in these ways, because sometimes it does require kind of a partnership with the school, if somebody is going to participate in treatment. Did that answer the
Um,
question sufficiently?
yeah, and I guess because you mentioned too, and Susie mentioned that it seems like maybe younger kids more often are encountering maybe the beginnings of, some
Hmm.
behaviors that can either lead to an eating disorder if it's not full blown. And I imagine, like you said, there can be co-occurring things. I imagine,
Hmm.
children who also have struggles in school due to dyslexia or things like that that create additional
Totally.
stressors. I can imagine that this is kind of can become a coping behavior as well. And so I'm wondering, and I'm really at the beginning of my trying to understand and wrap my brain around this as well. Have there been sort of adapted materials to talk to younger kids about this? Because it feels, and that might just be like the fear of as a parent, like a lot to just come in and say, I think you have this thing, an eating disorder can feel like a big word. Or,
Totally.
like, is there sort of materials or recommendations you would have about talking to younger people about behaviors that feel potentially concerning?
Yeah, absolutely. So, a couple of things. Yes, there have been adaptations to treatment for individuals that are younger. So, FBT, which is family-based treatment, is the frontline evidence-based treatment for younger humans, and FBT really puts caregivers in charge. So eating disorder treatment does tend to be insight oriented. It does tend to be, processing different internal experiences. It does require, kind of a um, developmental stage that not everybody's at. And so sometimes we do have to ask questions in ways that are a little bit more age appropriate and not necessarily have an expectation for insight. And so the FBT it's an outpatient approach, meaning because they're younger, we don't expect them to participate in group therapy for 3 hours a day. And so, on an outpatient basis, they meet with their FBT therapist and a dietitian once a week. And when I say they, it's not just the kiddo, it's primarily the caregivers or caregiver, whomever it is that kind of oversees this young person. And sometimes the young person doesn't even need to be there because it is about helping the caregivers get their kiddo back to a place of eating regularly and adequately with inclusion of variety. And sometimes that is parental skills or skills that caregivers need to implement in order to help their child achieve what they need to. Um, so it's definitely been adapted. There's a book called Surviving FBT that is a great read for parents. And then also on our website, there's a whole packet of information on FBT. So that's something that, folks that are working with youth can have an awareness of and, could even read a little bit about it to better understand kind of the approach. Because when I've worked with like 10-year-olds, for example, it really is very different questions that I'm asking, so I think it needs to be age appropriate, developmentally appropriate too. Good
That's
question.
really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Along, excuse me, along that same line, has there been any curriculum adopted for younger students? I think about we have a farm program and our fifth graders engage in a culinary program. So they cook the
Love
vegetables
it.
that they're harvesting. It's super cool, but we don't have a health program. So I'm wondering, is that a place that we could perhaps begin to talk about that?
Ooh, yes, it is. And Susie, I'm going to get back to you about it because I would need to look for curriculum. I am frequently dismayed when I hear about health curriculum and kind of what some of the focus is. Back in the day when I was just getting out of treatment, my mom was actually a fifth grade teacher, and I went through her health curriculum with like a highlighter and a red pen. It was like, no, 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 like this is not going to be helpful to say to a fifth grader. Or we have a adolescent right now who's I think she's a junior in high school. She's supposed to be doing a assignment for her health class that we've encouraged her to kind of tweak it a little bit because it's really activating from an eating disorder standpoint. So I will look and see if there are any curriculum that are kind of what we would call weight inclusive. So not, um, vilifying particular body sizes, which many health classes unfortunately do, and that are food neutral, because I think it's a wonderful time. But I need to look into whether or not there's kind of an approved curriculum, because I think that would be a wonderful place to introduce it. And that should be information I know. So I will for sure look into that.
Thank
Adding
you.
it to my to-do right now. Yeah. Any other questions? I know we're coming up on time. And Susie has my information. I am not opposed to getting emails or phone calls if there are questions or even, consultation need. We also do offer monthly consultation that is virtual. Out of our Seattle site and out of my site. So twice a month, there's a consultation opportunity if people wanted to come, but caregivers are welcome to call me, ask questions, express concern, whatever it might be. Any of your personnel are welcome to call me. I'm, like I said at the beginning of this, I'm very passionate about what I do. So I don't tend to limit how I can support and what I can do.
Hey, Stacy, do you have time for one more question?
Of course.
Okay, it's going to piggyback on Lauren's. This is Todd Williams. So anyway, it's going to piggyback on Lauren's, and I'm not sure that I heard the answer to my question that
Okay.
I have here. And that is, when I look at those slides that you have and I go through the individual slides, I could almost change the title of the slide to symptoms of autism or symptoms of ADHD. And for those of us who are caregivers, if we have somebody who has ADHD or autism, how do we ever take a look and say, oh, they're pacing around the room? Is that autism, or is that they're doing paces? They don't like the texture of the food. Is that eating, or is that autism? They're
Yeah.
forgetting to eat. Well, is that because squirrel? I mean, how how do we take all these little things that you have on the slides and turn them into something that we can then use as parents or caregivers to say, okay, maybe I need to go and investigate this a little bit more and not look like just the paranoid parent. You
Yeah.
understand what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How do we
Tis
do
a
that?
very, yeah, no, it's a really good question. And I think it is, it's blurry, right? Like there's no one indicator that somebody has an eating disorder. And, it can be tricky to educate and be like, look for this thing. And I think what is helpful is having dialogue with your youth about, what it is they're experiencing. How are they feeling in their relationship with food? How are they feeling about their relationship with movement? How are they feeling in their relationship with body? Because those are really what's going to give you information. If somebody's like, no, I don't want to eat, it's going to make me gain weight. Oh, that's a red flag. That's not ADHD or autism. That's, a concern, or I can't eat these. I can't eat an adequate amount for my body because of textural aversions or because of X, Y, or Z. It's like, okay, and we gotta achieve our dietary needs somehow. So while it may be a symptom of something else, the inability to achieve dietary needs becomes a problem in their relationship with food. And so it winds up being not necessarily eating disorder primary, because the eating disordered behaviors may be a symptom of a different condition. And at the same time, we're probably going to treat it similarly because we have to help an individual eat regularly. So if, for example, it's ADHD and there's no pattern of eating, there's no regularity to eating, it's more of kind of a chaotic eating pattern. In treatment, we'd probably be setting alarms. We'd probably be, helping them establish structure to their day related to eating in order to achieve adequacy. So I think it's a great question, Todd, that, how do I differentiate between? And I think being able to ask those questions just curiously with compassion. I do want to better understand what's happening here. I get that you lose track of time and you forget to eat. Okay, and we still need to eat adequately. So how are we going to do that? And if there is like pushback, or if there's resistance, or if there's hesitation to eat adequately, it's like, and we need to do this because not eating adequately, particularly at their age, we have so many kids that come in that their height is stunted because they haven't nourished their body adequately or haven't been able to nourish their body adequately, or their weight is significantly suppressed off their growth chart. So I think I agree with you that those symptoms can be indicators of different conditions, and we need to know more about relationship with food and movement and body. Does that answer your question as clear as mud?
I think it did. I'm looking at someone across the room here who's shaking her head too, saying, okay, I agree with the question. I agree with the answer. I think, because to me, this is just a big challenge, is how you can drain the lake and find the rocks and figure out what rocks you need to get out of the lake.
Yeah, yeah. The complexities and just the confluence of factors is kind of hard to tease apart, and I think what we come down to is we need to make sure that humans, and youth in particular, are eating adequately, and are staying within their growth plan. And if something's interfering with that, we want to attend to it.
Imagine sometimes a label itself can feel so heavy, so we can tread like, I don't know, I'm looking for 100% clarity on if this fits this label, versus I do think sometimes your instincts, because the nuances of your child are such a great indicator. And if you have questions, I always imagine like more support is never gonna hurt, but I know for myself sometimes thinking like, oh, I don't know if they fit perfectly what I imagine this diagnosis means for their life, or who they are, their identity, or my identity as a parent. And sometimes just like it sounds like it can just be very nuanced. And sometimes there's a mind, and
Mhm.
removing the label sometimes and just looking for the supportive help to help the behaviors that they need to be healthy, or what you're after. And so
Absolutely.
I don't know, that's one of those things that feels so humbling as a parent. And just
Absolutely.
it's amazing to me always, like all these unconscious bias I discover that I have, because you think, oh, this is what this means, abstractly, and then when it's affecting your family members or your own life, you go, oh, okay,
Mhm.
actually, this is a lot more complex and nuanced.
Yeah,
Wow.
absolutely. Which
Well,
is part of, yeah, sorry, I was just gonna say one more thing, which is part
please,
of when
please,
you
please.
look at the slides, you'll see that I kind of go between disordered eating and clinical eating disorder, because I think there is stigma, and there is like, I don't have an eating disorder. Like I was talking about that 15-year-old that talking about it was cringy because she didn't want to acknowledge, which is, it's okay. And it's why we talk about relationship with food a lot, so that it is like, it's your relationship with food. And, if we're having trouble achieving adequacy, we don't need to worry about the label per se. I mean, for
Mhm.
insurance reasons, we do. But it's also one of the eating disorders, other specified feeding or eating disorder, because it's like this is a feeding challenge that we're having, and it doesn't meet necessary criteria, but we want to attend to it. Go ahead, Susie. Sorry.
I was just going to say thank you. That we so
Mhm.
appreciate what you shared, and I appreciate everybody being here today. And I want to make sure others, please spread the word to other families that that this will be on the website, because it feels like such important information for families to have. So we're really grateful,
Yeah.
Stacy. Thank you
Oh,
so much.
thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it. And feel free to reach out if you have questions, and have a wonderful Friday and a good weekend.
Thank you.
See you. Thank you.